So I guess this is our first official meeting of the school year, technically?
First non-reorganization meeting of the
Right.
school year.
We have 3 board members missing, Brian, Erin, and Beth, and they're on vacation. Raina and Carol, welcome. Glad you guys are back from vacation. I'm sure you're not. Can I have a motion to accept tonight's agenda?
So moved.
Second?
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, great. I think we could skip 3.1 as we have no one here from the community to ask any questions or comments on our agenda. Are we going to have any remarks opening for you? No, not on this agenda.
Not on this agenda,
Okay.
but I can, if you're inviting me to, I always can find a space for a few
No,
words.
no.
But just we're all gearing up, excited for another great school year. Dr. Kaur and many of our colleagues have participated the last 2 days in facilitating, leading the new teacher academy. And so we have a number of dynamic new educators joining our team here in Irvington. And saw a number of them at the end of the day who were just enthused and really feel welcome. Dr. Kaur started today's session by asking everyone to share some reflections on their first day in Irvington. And everyone talked about feeling supported and welcomed, and the connections that they're making, and impressed with the work that's going on here in the district. And the enthusiasm is still very high today. I'd also like to say that, as everyone knows, we hired a number of new administrators who have really jumped right in and have been doing an excellent job. Last week we had a 2-day administrative retreat where we had the opportunity to really come together and bond as a group and start to work together to develop our collaborative thinking. So it's been a great process. And then tomorrow we're excited to welcome all of our faculty and staff back for the annual superintendent conference days. We have our district meeting in the morning, a lovely breakfast provided by the PTSA. And then everybody will be off in their buildings and departments for a day and a half getting ready for our kiddos to arrive on the 3rd. So we're gearing up, ready to go. We always have to give our accolades to all the support staff, particularly custodians and clerical, who do tremendous amounts of work to help us prepare for the start of the school year. And they've done it again. We'll be ready for next Tuesday.
I know the meetings that you had with the administrators happened at the Village Nature Center, and how the village was really excited that you guys used the space.
Yeah.
We're very excited about that.
Yeah.
And I guess also we have a teacher amongst us who published a book that was just released, Mr. Barry, which was exciting.
My copy arrived Sunday. I started reading it.
Yeah, very, very exciting. Okay, great. So first up, item agenda 4.1 is the approval of the Administrative Association's agreement. This is not part of the consent agenda, right?
Correct. It's
Okay.
a standalone. And
You have to do a roll call, okay. Before we approve this, I want to say thank you to Michael and to Brian, who's not here, who represented us on the board, on the negotiation team, and Carol, Raina, Chris, thank you. Exciting to start this school year with all of our contracts signed, sealed, delivered, so this is exciting. So thank you, all of you guys, for all of your hard work making this happen.
Yeah, let's see how it turns out. But no, it's been a really positive experience, and it's great to work with our district leadership and with our administrators. Once we got going, it came together pretty quickly. So
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay. Pauline? Okay, can I have a motion to accept item 4.1?
so moved.
Second? Aye? Aye?
aye.
Fantastic.
All right. Congratulations, everyone.
Congratulations to everyone for this. This is fantastic. Okay. Can I have a motion to accept tonight's consent agenda?
Before we do that, I was wondering if
Sorry.
that's to get your attention. If we could pull
I was
six.
going to, yeah, I was
Okay.
gonna do that. Yep. Okay.
So, I mean, for a separate vote, not just discussion.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, well, okay, fine. So that's 6.1.
Yep.
Okay. So, okay, great. Let me just make sure. Okay, can I have a motion to accept tonight's consent agenda from items 6.2 through 6.7? I'm sorry, 9.7. So moved.
Second.
Okay, all those, before the vote, does anyone want to talk about any of the items on the agenda? We have policies, we have some appointments. Does anyone have any questions, clarifying questions or anything like that?
Well, I wish there was people here, because I would love to pull out and talk about 6.3.
6.3, the adoptions
how
of the
that,
policies.
Just so that, it's a significant change. that's
Yes.
all. So it'd be important, I think, for people maybe watching or whatever to sort of hear about that, if they don't necessarily go to look, I don't know.
Right, so I guess I could, or Dr. Harrison, would you like to speak to why this is a first, we are waiving the first read, and we're adopting them tonight?
Sure, and I certainly would invite Dr. Corda to chime in as well. So the policies that are being adopted this evening without the traditional first read, and might I add, in accordance with Board of Education policy, are three policies that relate to the use of technology in our schools. The first, computer use and instruction, or commonly known as the acceptable use policy. Student use of personal electronic devices, and then students and personal electronic devices or bring your own device policies. And then there is students in temporary housing, or formerly known as a homeless students policy. So the first three related to technology are being revised due to the implementation of the one-to-one initiative that is being launched in Irvington Middle School. As a result of that, we needed to make a few modest modifications to the policies. The one that really should stand out to most folks is the BYOD policy, which previously had permitted our students in the middle school and high school to bring their own devices for use in the classroom. In particular, the one thing that should stand out is the use of cell phones, which will no longer be permitted in the middle school environment. Students are certainly free to use their personal devices before and after school, but during the school day, personal devices are to be put away and not used, and only devices that should be used during the school day would be school-issued Chromebooks. So we're excited, as this certainly is going to bring new resources to our classrooms by being able to extend learning to the internet and to more digital media. And additionally, we're pleased to see that we're going to be reducing that disruption of smartphones, cell phones, social media from our classrooms. If you didn't see, there was a News 12 story that aired yesterday that featured some of our community members that have been leading the Heads Up Rivertown initiative, and Mr. Sotil, our principal, that talked about kind of the alignment of those efforts, which I think was a nice acknowledgement of the focus and the initiative that's coming from a collaborative place in the district, parents, Board of Ed, and the educational team.
I would like to also add that due to vacations and the policy committee met last week to revise these, and then immediately it went out to the board, and it appeared on tonight's agenda. So we tried to get together earlier, but this is when
I
we
just
can
want to
get
make sure
together.
parents are aware of like
Yep.
the changes and, like how this might, in the end, tie to, I guess, what we're talking about 6.1 also with the code of conduct and sort of how that looks in each building, and, kids use cell phones in the middle school in the study hall, what happens to that phone, and sort of like, just want to make sure parents are fully clear on those things.
Yeah, not permitted. And things are going to be, as the one-to-one initiative is rolled out in the middle school, and it's going to be a staged rollout, there will be ample communication that will go to parents and students. There'll be orientation programs with students. There's also going to be a dedicated webpage as resources related to both all the policies and protocols associated with that. We have some agreements that are currently being reviewed by legal counsel that will go to families and students as well, in and around proper use and care for the devices.
And it also should be noted that e-readers are exempt, as students can use their e-readers to read. Right.
And I would just note that a few other modifications, the other policies, really just to contemporize them a little bit. That references the pagers had been removed, and just using more contemporary language in those cases and to reflect current practice. So thank you for drawing that out, but there'll be lots of information that'll be going to the middle school community, and you'll hear more about it in these meetings, I'm sure. And then finally, the board had adopted previously policy 5151, which was homeless students, and we utilized the school board's model for those revisions to reflect new legislation in the state of New York. Dr. Kaur was leading what is a routine desk audit practices and procedures for the state of New York, and one of the areas they had recommendation was that we actually utilize a New York State templated policy rather than the school board's model. The policy is rather detailed, and a lot of the content that you would find in that would often be built into a regulation as opposed to a policy, but they were very explicit in their communications with Dr. Kaur that they wanted to see a policy in that form. We reviewed it entirely. We are compliant with all the practices and protocols. You use forms linked in there, and we, with feedback from policy committee, actually added a couple additional resources for any parents that may find themselves in a need to take advantage of such services, that it goes beyond those state resources and pointing them to some local county-based agencies as well.
Thank you.
Very welcome. And the final note I would make is that Ms. Davies is in communication with the New York State School Boards Association to make sure we get proper alignment with numbers, the policies to fit them into the new sequence of the numbering as we're adopting the new policies. So if need be, by matter of resolution, if we have to change the numbers, we will do that at a future meeting. But what was important is to have the policies on the book before all students arrive in each case.
Okay, so, all those in favor of adopting the consent agenda? Any other questions before I ask for a vote? No? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Fantastic, and I would like to thank the IEF and the PTSA once again for their generous grants to our schools. Okay, let's go back to item 6.1, the adoption of the Code of Conduct. Michael, you asked that we pull this out of the consent agenda. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so just before the vote on the Code of Conduct as it's presented on this agenda, I just wanted to ask that we could speak about it. And I want to just headline that I'm hesitant to support approving the Code of Conduct in its current form. I wanted to share an excerpt from a recently published report by a commission that includes a number of attorneys from the firm that represents the district regarding the discipline process in the state of New York when it comes to schools. The current system punishes misconduct by exclusion. Students with Code of Conduct violations are removed from the school setting and often placed into situations in which supervision and, most importantly, instruction and the positive socialization effects of a school setting are not present during the day. So again, this is a statement about the overarching system and legislation in our state. By contrast, at our July meeting that launched our new academic year, the reorg meeting, Dr. Harrison, you provided a thoughtful reflection about the shifts that you and your administrative team are leading around the Code of Conduct and discipline process. You noted the importance of consequences for misconduct and that the process is or should be rooted in the fact that we are a learning community. If you could, I was wondering if you could speak about the Code of Conduct and any shifts that are occurring with it, particularly the dress code and discipline. Where are we in the process?
Sure. So thank you for quoting me from the meeting last month. So there's maybe two general questions there, Michael. And the first is looking at the Code of Conduct. So the district is committed, as I communicated last year, and then we extended the process to this year because of the shifts in our administration and wanting to ensure that our new administrators were able to contribute to the discussion. But looking to revise our dress code, which is contained within the current proposed code of conduct. So I've mapped out a draft timeline that would include work with the administrative team that is actually ongoing at this point in time, and looking at potential modifications to our existing dress code. That then would be sent out to the broader school community for feedback. So any member of our community would have the opportunity to share their thoughts about the revisions to the proposed code. And then there we will be soliciting participants from the community to sit on a committee that will actually review that feedback and look to make recommendations on revisions to the existing code that would be presented to the Board of Education for consideration. So when we consider all those different steps, I think it's important to highlight that there's rounds of engagement with school staff that have the responsibility for, one, administering it, and two, know really the ins and outs of the cultures of our schools, and to make sure that the code does represent what our beliefs are as professionals. That opportunity for Board of Education to preview it, likely through the policy committee as well. And then we would distribute it community-wide. So there's one opportunity for large-scale stakeholder feedback. That feedback then will be collected, as I said, in a representative group, which will, again, include stakeholders, including students. We'll be able to consider that feedback, and then we will make final recommendations that would come to the Board of Education for review. So at that point in time, brings us from our current time to the end of October, the timeline targeting opportunity for not only the public engagement and the necessary revision, but opportunity for public dialogue, and then, of course, adoption at the end of the year, or at the end of the month. That being said, we would live within the context of the current code until such time. And at that point in time, the board would be asked to readopt the code with the inclusion of the new standards that would be recommended to the board. At that date, moving forward, those standards would be what would be, we'd educate our students and community upon, and would be enforced on a daily basis. So I don't know if I want to stop there before we go to the other.
I would only say that sounds like an excellent process.
All right, thank you. And then I would say regarding, I would echo the comments that I made back in the beginning of July with respect to disciplinary consequences. And so there's a piece to it that I think we separate what the code of conduct is, which identifies expectations on all members in the school community. So that's the professional staff, roles that parents play, the roles that students have, and a general, while specific in place, certain places it can't be all-inclusive, identifying expectations for behaviors, the do's and don'ts of what we would expect in a school environment, and identifies potential consequences. The structure of what is prohibited and maybe from a positive standpoint permitted in schools, at this point in time we're not seeing significant revision to anything along those lines. What it comes into play is the practice and the reflection upon the types of consequences, maybe to reference the other quote that you had, Michael, related, that you credited to Ingram and Smith, would be looking at the duration of consequences. And that's something that is under review and consideration at this time, and dialogue that is ongoing with the administrators. And certainly our intent is for students to have learning experiences. We want to be able to provide supports for students and their families where appropriate and necessary, and to minimize the impacts on the students' learning, one, and two, their social-emotional well-being as it associates to their socialization and connection to the school community.
So, I guess I would contrast the two examples you just gave of process with one that had a timeline and a number of steps that included the balance you need in terms of working together as an administrative team, and what the practicalities and challenges are there, with also bringing into the fold the input of stakeholders, and then leading to a process in which one of the defined outcomes is a revision of the code of conduct. I would say in the second example you gave, we don't have a number of those aspects. And so, certainly I think, just since, from your comments that you shared today and in July, and my chance when I've been able to speak informally over the past with other trustees, I think we're looking for that shift that you're talking about. But this is a conversation that we started informally back in the spring, and clearly we all recognize, and I appreciate the significant number of tasks that the administration had at that time, the board. And so it was difficult to start this process then, but I certainly I wouldn't want to see another year pass. And I know that you can't do everything at once, but I think what you've explained is a shift in approach and in philosophy. So while there's practical changes that you're talking about, and I presume will be somewhat incremental, one of the challenges I have with this current code of conduct is it doesn't even philosophically reflect that shift. And so I guess I would look to hear if it's possible that we start to align this second process in with similar steps and timeline to what you described around the dress code. I know one thing that you and the executive team have set up is a discussion on September 10th. That's the focus of our next meeting in terms of having a discussion about the discipline process. So I think, for one, as I share a few more things here, I'd love for other trustees to share some of their points of view. But I think, that meeting on the 10th, not unlike the process you said around the dress code, provides a point at which we can have some significant discussion, but it shouldn't only be discussion. I would hope that it will lead to some clear outcomes. And while I don't expect that you could change every line of the code of conduct this year, and I think I agree with your estimation that there's no, that in many cases what's there is fine. I do think that, in your leadership and your team's leadership in framing this shift that's occurring, that it should be like Dave asked regarding the dress code, that it should be clearly communicated. I think it should reflect input from the community, and I think that I think it would be good if we could define a goal of doing some redefining of how we approach discipline in a public manner in a time frame that occurs this fall, and not something that's going to happen further down the line.
Yeah, when I think we step back and we look at it, we're acknowledging, and I have publicly now twice acknowledged some philosophical shifts that are strong considerations, and really communicated some personal beliefs, I think, in and around the topic of discipline. I think as an outgrowth of the meeting on the 10th, we certainly can look to create opportunities in the potential timeline to consider what revisions can be made to that component of a code. And if the board is in agreement, that we can look at mapping out a broader scale process for a deeper review for larger scale prospective changes, should it be the desire of the board.
So coming out of that meeting of the 10th, if the board was to make have some consensus around that, that's something that you feel the administration could then work with in terms of defining a timeline and making some of those changes. That while I don't define, I'm alluding to the potential that we could do that.
Yeah, I think we see where the conversation goes. What is really practical within a couple different lenses, from the ability of leading the school from a policy perspective, and from a pacing of work and responsibilities, that we could identify what the appropriate timelines would be to modify adjustments. I think some potential edits or revisions could be made that are more tied to the introduction of the existing document in the more immediate term, with setting longer range goals for more
mean, one reason I would strongly encourage it, and again, on the 10th, I think the board would have a chance, as they have now, to weigh in, is that I think it's been made clear with the dress code, it's something, and the code of conduct in general is something that's provided to all students, and they're asked to review and reflect upon and to, I believe, sign. And so, in changing and having a discussion around changing that sort of, one of the key terms at the beginning is the philosophy. Why do we have a code of conduct? What is the purpose of this? To have that reflected in something that we're asking everybody to read and abide by and feel, I think, in the way that you've discussed the dress code process, that it's also something that reflects the values of our stakeholders, that's something that we shouldn't skip, that while we appreciate you sharing it here in this setting, I think that's the way that most people will be able to really connect with this shift, because not everybody watches the board meeting video, and I think it will make it more concrete in the minds of our community members as they participate and ultimately agree to those changes.
Piggyback on that?
Yes, please.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no?
Yep, go ahead.
More first?
You start, David.
You sure? So I've got lots to say on this particular topic, but I think that's a better time would be the 10th when we have a bigger, large-scale discussion. I think that it's important to just at this juncture tie back to last year some of how this plays out in the bigger, broader context of sort of other district priorities. In particular, the social emotional learning component, and thinking about, analyzing the budget as we did as a board over the months last year, and seeing the social worker ask, and tying this kind of work to that in a really,
Potentially.
in an authentic way that the community sees the real, like in terms of like the philosophy is one thing, but having a significant amount of experience in this particular field, the execution of that philosophy, as supported by the budget, which is our responsibility to sort of explain why we're spending on certain things, and why we're adding staff, and where we need the extra staff and those things. So I think it would be really important to kick off this process, that wonderful process that you described. Thank you. I echo your sentiment on that. Like, it's a really great process for us to involve everybody, but I think tying it back to those key items is a really important step for this work.
I agree. I also, another discussion that the executive team had with Dr. Harrison is also the process in which the board reviews the code of conduct on a yearly basis, and we spoke about changes going forward on how it should appear on an agenda at the end of the school year to talk about any potential changes to be revised over the summer, so it's ready for when the school year starts. So even in addition to everything that you had stated earlier, Michael, we have also talked about that, correct, Dr. Harrison?
Right, but so-
Initiated the
so-
conversation.
Right, we initiated the conversation.
There's an added note to that.
Sorry.
There's been no conclusions drawn, but that idea about having a different process for board review.
Developing a new process.
Is different than how it's been
Right.
done for eons.
Right, but I want to just stress the execution of that philosophy over that course of time. As Michael, you noted, you mentioned, while this is in play, while this is happening, there's still going to be things that, the execution of this philosophy is deeper than just the code of conduct itself, deeper than these, whatever the policies are, et cetera, or the consequences at the building level, is really just a matter of that philosophy and that execution of that philosophy, while we're moving towards that change, should reflect what that vision is. And I just want to make sure that we're all paying.
Yeah. And I appreciate that we have this window of opportunity to do it. This is your 8th year, I think you've mentioned, and this is my 5th year on the board, and I think one of my first emails I happened to come across to you and some of the executive team at that time was around this topic, so I'm glad that we're in a space and time where we can address it. It's something that, as you noted in July, is happening, I think, throughout the state, and so I'm glad that we can give it focus now. Did you have something that I was just going to follow up with another question or two, but
I am grateful that both that you've raised it and championed it over the years, Michael, very much. And David, I appreciate what you've said already about just how complex it is to execute. I appreciate that greatly, and I know we sat here, the way that we sat here last spring, talking about the staff that we'd like to have versus the staff that we could afford, and that played a role in how the social emotional learning and discipline processes got so play out. I mean, those are real concerns, and so I very much support this discussion that's happening right now. I'm incredibly grateful that the administration is open to it, and that my colleagues have done so much work and digging, particularly Michael, around what those trends are and how we are trying to stay abreast of them.
Well, I think we, everybody at the table pretty much has had some reflection about it, as well as those who weren't able to be here today. But because this is the 5th time that I get to vote on this code of conduct, and the first time that I feel like there's a momentum to actually shift it, I think it's worth underscoring. Just in leading up to this meeting on the 10th, I wonder what's envisioned. Are we looking, is it, because it is, involves the important perspectives of stakeholders, do we envision, or could we envision bringing, or inviting some of those stakeholders to that meeting, including some of your administrative leaders, our building leaders, possibly guidance, possibly faculty, possibly staff, to at least make aware that this conversation's happening? Is that something that?
Yeah, we'll have to, one of the notes I made for myself is consideration of a different structure. So could open school in a couple days, and we can start to think about what that looks like.
Okay. I think we would benefit from hearing from some of those voices. Clearly, each is an important part of it. I think, one of the conversations too is around, and that you noted in July, was around out-of-school suspensions. And so I'm wondering, for your discussion on the 10th, is there some way to quantify sort of be ready to outline the process, but also quantify what the costs are? Because I certainly would be one that would be interested to hear about the opportunities to have consequences that occur in school, because that keeps, it speaks directly to the quote that I shared at the beginning, that we want to make this an experience that those who have broken the code of conduct can learn from, but also that our community can see real change and feel reassured that we are moving forward together. I think some feedback that I've heard informally is that we don't have resources, or we don't have sort of a structure or funding for some of what could be done as in school. So I don't know what the costs are, but that certainly at a board level, at an administration level, if it's about resources, it would be, I think, an important part of that discussion. So is that something we could do? Is there a way you imagine that we could quantify? And would the board support having that kind of information put together?
I don't know that it's possible to have something like that prepared for the 10th, but as a part of an ongoing process, we could certainly explore different aspects of the topic.
Well, I guess, what if we try to define it? It's when there is say a student is suspended for an extended amount, there's a week-to-week cost generally related to services that are provided, and it certainly could vary based on the needs of the student, but is there a way to explain to us what those types of costs are, so that we can be able to get a sense of what the scale of when we look at the raw numbers of, obviously I forget what the number is, but it's a very low percentage of students ultimately who are suspended.
Yeah.
But
I think a part of it is, what I'm concerned about right now, Michael, is that I feel like that we're having a conversation, the 10th conversation now.
I think that's exactly right, because I'd like to spur the conversation to be as productive as it can on the 10th, and so I think it's easy for us to end up in a place where we haven't had a chance to discuss the opportunities and potential of a conversation like that, so rather than.
And I think what you're doing now is just asking the questions in anticipation of the 10th, because you're not going to be here on the 10th.
Well, it doesn't matter whether I'm here or not, I think, I would ask you.
What I hear Michael saying,
Is-
to be honest, because I not only am I looking over his shoulder, but I also had a fifth bullet that I wanted to add. I think what he's trying to do, and please correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong, but is sort of create bullet points for an agenda of that discussion, so we don't wander all over the joint. Right?
And also that we come in prepared with information. I mean, I think for us to wax poetic in a discussion like that about what our feelings and perceptions are is not completely unproductive, but it would benefit from having data. I think we've talked about the systematic use of data. I think this is a good example of if we're going to have a discussion about the discipline process, let's understand. I think, you know, I would imagine and expect that you would be pulling together information from the discipline reports in terms of what the numbers are, in terms of, you know, how many students are suspended, if that's part of the conversation. So that's a piece of data. I think some generic way to understand what the resources are related to that is important. And particularly because I know from talking to community members and other board members that there's interest in what can we do in school. And so if it's about resources, then it's important to know what the resources are that are being used for the out-of-school
I'd add to
suspension.
that also how those resources are being professionally developed, which goes back to
Yeah.
the fifth piece, which I think, how does this connect to the professional development plan? We've been sort of looking for, talking about, right? Like philosophy, execution, means of execution is generally the human resources, right? And training the human resources in how to be restorative, right, in their classrooms and do the things that you're suggesting, right? You know, how do we heal some of the things that are happening inside the classroom, you know, with curriculum, et cetera, and training teachers to that effect. So I would love that, put the bullet there, or whatever, to be sort of like, get in, you know, sketch that out. Where does that live in this process that you've designed, the great process that you set up?
So there's out-of-school suspension, there's information from your discipline reports, there's information about suspensions. I also know that, you know, while I think we have our legal counsel in the audience, I believe that legislatively, suspension is the tool, the hammer that districts have when it comes to discipline. But there are, in this code of conduct, a lot of other options that come before that legislative hammer is used in terms of other methods, and those are noted. I mean, some of them, I mean, you know, I would think that trustees would be asking about things that are noted in the code of conduct, like restitution or restorative measures, or peer leadership, peer counsel. What's the term?
Mediation.
Is it peer mediation? And then, like we're talking about school, in-school suspension options. So that those are in the code of conduct, are we able to speak to those on the 10th and say that we use or don't use those?
So what I would say is that there's this very clear need to have a structure to guide the conversation.
Mhm.
And I think you framed some of the possible entry points that we could utilize. And then I think that I can certainly collaborate with the exec team to put together a plan for that meeting.
I mean, one final one I'll mention for reflection is that, and that's the point I was actually trying to get to with this statement, is that I know that the administration looks to support students with interventions if those are understood, but I wonder if there's a way to look at what those interventions have been and any way of understanding what the outcomes have been, whether anecdotally or ideally more generally for students when they receive those interventions. Because that's, I guess, those are the tools that are being used, and it would be good for trustees to understand them, and for the board and administration to have some sense of or begin the discussion about how effective those measures are, those interventions are. So, I mean, I guess what I would ask, is there anyone here who would disagree with the idea of the executive team and the superintendent looking very closely at what sorts of information and data they can bring to the table on the 10th?
Of course.
Sure. Absolutely. Now, we started this whole conversation because we have the code of conduct on our agenda to accept tonight. So, having this conversation, and are you comfortable for the board
Yeah, I mean, I think
voting on it?
I don't like voting for this one, but my understanding is that, based on the conversations on the 10th, that could lead to some additional consideration of process around discipline, and so with that, I'd be ready to support it.
Okay, great. Okay. Do I have to do it again? Yeah, right? Okay. Can I have a motion to accept item 6.1, adoption of the code of conduct?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
I just want to follow up, I agree with Michael. I think that the process that, Chris, Dr. Harrison, that you described is super important to that particular
Okay.
focus.
Oh, thank you very much. So, let's see, 10.1, comments for community members or questions. Seeing no one in our audience except for Gus. Our next meeting is September 10th, here, 7:30 in the CPR room. Can I have a motion to go into executive session for the purpose of discussion of matters pertaining to collective bargaining and the employment history of a particular person?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.